Thank you so much, Sam. And thank you, Timpanogos, for inviting me to do this. What an honor. And for being here. Because, man, if y'all weren't here, then this would be my whole audience. I thought, for my first story here, I would tell you a travel story. Something I'm missing a lot right now is traveling. And so this is a story about a stranger that I met named Eddie Mology. There was a stranger that I will always remember, a man by name of Eddie Mology. I met Eddie Mology in a place called the Diner Motel. That was the name of the diner that was attached to the motel. The reason the diner was called the Diner Motel is because the sign company put the words on backwards 30 years ago, and this was the kind of town where people adapt better than they complain. When I walked in and saw Eddie, I could tell immediately that he was a peacemaker, and I could tell that from the fact that his blue striped shirt and brown slacks did not agree with one another at all, and yet he made them hang out together anyway. Eddie Mology was the kind of fellow that you knew you would never forget 4 sentences in. He just turned to me and he said, "I like to march to the beat of my own dead horse." You could not describe Eddie if you wanted to without describing his most conspicuous characteristic. The man had an eye patch because back in the 70s he'd lost an eye in an unfortunate tractor accident. But most recently, there's this 7-year-old girl in his neighborhood who took up visual art. So Eddie suggested she paint on his eye patches. He said, "You know, I figured it was going to be like a sunset or something." The girl painted an eye on the patch. You know, the saddest part of that story is she's the one that thought of it. The one he was wearing the day I met him looked just like a wink. There was a stranger that I will always remember, a man by name of Eddie Mology. He was a walking book of quips and lies and legends, and I won't forget the time he said to me, "Sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down, but most times you're in between the two. And the clock keeps ticking, now, 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 but the future stays ahead of you." Well, the waitress that normally gave Eddie a ride home was working a double that day. And so I offered, and he said, "Oh, good, you could see the seesaw that I'm building in my backyard." Under most circumstances, that'd be considered a weird thing to say, but not with Eddie Mology. When we got to his front porch, there were 2 vacuum cleaners hanging on the wall of the front porch. 2 vacuum cleaners just hanging out there, outdoors, on the front wall of the front porch. I had to ask about them. He said, "Well, them vacuum cleaners died, so they are taxidermy. You should come inside and see the typewriter I got hung up on the living room wall. You know, typewriters are an endangered species, which explains why typewriter taxidermy is so rare." Eddie Mology spoke in entire lectures. That was the unit of measurement by which he spoke. And the waitress at the diner, she warned me. She said, "Oh, honey, if he gets going good on one of his crazy talks, you know, going downhill, it's like he can inhale through his ear holes." She wasn't wrong. He lived alone, ate at the diner twice a day, had a favorite stool, old cracked blue Naugahyde. It tilted left to right real hard, but didn't spin, and they promised him they wouldn't fix it till he died. The lecture I got treated to. When Eddie Mology was 9 years old, the story goes, he was a child prodigy linguist. He discovered simultaneous present past tense words. You know your simultaneous present past tense words, right? Flip-flop, chit-chat, seesaw, tick-tock, and sometimes zigzag. He said that to me. I said, He went, is present tense, and frankly kind of sounds double stupid. Well, the story goes that 9-year-old Eddie Mology was studying the seesaw to determine the answer to the age-old question, which came first, the sea or the saw? Well, this was his theory at the time, that see was the present tense when you're sitting in that top position, and it's see, so it's the present tense. That saw was the bottom position and the past tense, because it's saw. And that's when the epiphany hit. If saw is past tense and see is present tense, well, then that meant if you could get beyond see, you could go to the future. Eddie Mology discovered at 9 years old that a seesaw could be used as a crude time machine. Well, like any good scientist, he went out and tested his theory, didn't he? He went and got himself a shovel and a trampoline, or what he liked to call a bounced. And he dug a trench under that seesaw so the board would be able to go around 360 degrees without stopping. And then he got that trampoline and straddled that trench in the saw position. And then he got on that seesaw solo and he started getting himself some momentum, bouncing as high as he could until he finally got enough momentum to get to the C position. And then eventually he got enough momentum, went beyond C, and disappeared a year into the future. You know, most of us solo on a seesaw, it's just a sit-sat. But not Eddie Mology. When he did it, it was a time machine. I said to Eddie, "Are you trying to tell me that you're a year older than you are?" And he said, "Well, no, I got held back in 4th grade." He had more liver spots than a Dalmatian's liver, had hands that shook but were still strong and good. He could fill an hour with enough hot air to rise above. If I could give him one more hour of mine, I would. 'Cause sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down, but most times you're in between the two. And the clock keeps ticking, now, but the future stays ahead of you. Back in January, I drove past the Diner Motel and decided to stop in. Hoped to see Eddie there, you know. He wasn't there, but that waitress was there. And she told me that 6 months back, Eddie'd gotten a terrible diagnosis from a doctor, said he had less than a year to live. And so he came in, told everybody that, had his breakfast, and then left. That's the last everybody ever saw of him. She thinks that he must have moved in with some family somewhere to be comfortable. I just sat there eating my breakfast, thinking about that afternoon in Eddie's backyard, standing over that seesaw. He said to me, "You know, it's taken me over a month to get this far on this thing. I used to could have built something like this in a day. But ain't that the way it is? The less time you have, the more time it takes you to do anything." I don't know what happened to Eddie Mology, but I know what I believe. I believe Eddie Mology got that terrible diagnosis from that doctor. And I believe Eddie Mology went and got himself a shovel and a trampoline. And he dug a trench under that seesaw in his backyard. And Eddie Mology got himself some momentum and disappeared into the future. The waitress came over and filled up my mug, and the steam rose up, and it fogged up exactly 1/2 of her glasses. And when I looked at that stool next to me, they ain't fixed it yet. 'Cause sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down, but most times you're in between the two. And the clock keeps ticking, now. But the future stays ahead of you. There was a stranger that I will always remember, a man by name of Eddie Moore.